Hello, everybody. Welcome to our podcast. We are the risk-taking group, and basically what we do here is we talk about risk-taking and how we can be activists throughout it. And now for a quick introduction. My name is Chloe Stretz, and here to introduce themselves are my group members.
I'm Julyanna.
I'm DJ Snopel.
And I'm Raquel Barba.
And we are the risk-taking group. So basically what we're doing here is answer questions, hopefully give you guys some insight on what it is like to be in the risk-taking group. Now, how this podcast is going to work is this is going to be a weekly podcast where we talk about different topics related to risk-taking. And for this first podcast, I will be sort of introducing my members by asking them questions and how they feel about risk-taking and everything that comes with it. Okay, to hop right in, we have a question, and my question is, what would you guys describe risk-taking as? I believe Julyanna is going to start.
So I would describe risk-taking as making a decision consciously or unconsciously, and you have a perceived uncertainty about its outcome, and you really don't know about its possible benefits or cost.
Thank you, Julyanna. I think Raquel is going to answer the question as well.
Okay, so I totally agree with Julyanna, and I think that when you search up risk-taking, especially, for example, on collinsdictionary.com, it comes up as means taking actions which might have an unpleasant or undesirable result. So it definitely has that negative connotation to it, but it really means like whether or not you're balancing a decision. And when you look at it from a different perspective, it can be both good and bad, but it's all up to the actions that lead up to taking that risk.
The last person to answer will now be DJ.
I view risk-taking as essentially any decision that has a negative and positive consequence. And when you take a risk, you're essentially understanding that the negative consequence could happen to you, but you're hoping to get the positive outcome.
Thank you, group. All wonderful answers and hopefully gave our listeners some insight onto what risk-taking is. Now, to move on to the second question, I want to ask you guys, what do you think the difference between responsible risk-taking and irresponsible risk-taking? DJ.
I view responsible risk-taking essentially as if the positive outweighs the negative, or if the negative is in such a way that you don't really mind having to deal with the bad outcome. Of course you want the positive outcome, but if you're fine with dealing with the negative outcome, then it's probably a responsible risk to take.
Okay, I like that answer. To back that up, we will be moving on to Julyanna.
Just going back to what DJ was saying, I also think that responsible risk-taking is making yourself aware of the situation and all the possible consequences, whether they be good or bad, and how not only it can affect you, but it also affects the people around you. And then for irresponsible, I think that you kind of just say, oh, whatever happens, happens. And I know that it is a concept of risk-taking, but with irresponsible, you don't really analyze the position that you sort of put yourself in.
And last up to answer this question is Raquel.
So yeah, I think risk-taking or responsible risk-taking, you take calculated risk, which means you've thought of it before, you possibly consider all of the outcomes that can come out of taking this risk, and you're very thoughtful about it. It's not just on the spot or too spontaneous, although sometimes those can be good and have responsible outcomes. But irresponsible risk-taking is more on the spot thinking, probably takes place in not the best environment or situations. And so it usually tends to have a negative outcome.
Wonderful insight into the question. Thank you all. To move on, I'm going to ask you guys, do you take risks in your own personal life, or are you risk adverse? And I kind of want you guys to answer this question with what risk you take on a daily basis, or some bigger risks you've taken, or respond with why you don't take risks. First to answer this question will be Raquel.
Okay, so in my daily life, risks I take are pretty small because, given the current situation, I'm not really faced with any big situations where I have to decide, if it's a big risk to take. So it's more like, do I want to do my homework right now, or am I going to procrastinate? And then knowing those outcomes versus I think when, times were regular, one of the biggest risks, at least for me, was switching schools freshman year, because obviously the outcome could have been really good or really bad, but it was all about, how I thought about it. And it turned out to be not so bad.
Definitely, definitely. I think switching schools is probably one of the hardest risks many people do have to face, and I really appreciate your insight on that. Now to answer this question is DJ.
I do know that in the past, I've taken a lot of risks, a lot of which were not responsible. But ever since we started doing this little project, I've started to look a little more into my risks and gone, oh, maybe I shouldn't do that. I mean, me and my friends sometimes will go to a mall or whatever, and it sounds really stupid, but, we'll novice parkour. And obviously it does sound very dumb, but it was fun. And of course, risks are a natural part of life, but if you're just acting stupid, it doesn't make much sense.
Totally agree. And now the last person to answer this question is Juliana.
So can't really remember when I have taken a risk, and I'm sure that I have, obviously. I'm just not really like a risk-taking type of person, just because I'm more the type to where I kind of most of like aspects of my life sort of planned out. So I think that's why, because if I were to take risk, I just know it would automatically give me like really bad anxiety, not knowing what my outcomes are going to be.
I totally agree. And to move on, the next question is, what is something you would risk your own life to get? Juliana will be taking the stage.
So one of my ultimate goals in life is to have my future career as a pediatrician. So that's definitely something that I'm willing to risk for, just like all the sacrifices and all that come with studying, especially medicine, since it's so difficult. And I just know like having those late nights studying and skipping out like Friday nights, going out with my friends. But like at the end, I know that all those risky decisions that I probably have to make along the way are going to be worth it for my future.
Yes, when it comes to risk taking in your careers, it's definitely something that needs a lot of push and drive. And now to answer this question is Raquel.
Oh yeah, I totally agree. I think risk taking is really huge in like the career and the workforce industry and just in success in general, because there's so many times where you have to make that decision in order to get ahead in life. And that doesn't necessarily mean you have to step over other people, but more so make more personal risks for yourself and to advance. And I think that's one risk I would take in life is, to become successful, or risks in like my social life, in order to meet new people, especially if I tend to be a little bit more shy, just so I can step out of my comfort zone, but know that there's always a path ahead of me.
I totally agree, Raquel. Thank you for the insight. And now, DJ.
I didn't realize you guys were going to have such deep, meaningful risks to take. I was just going to say I would risk my life to help save my pets if they were in a bad situation. I mean, I've had to. We live in an area where snakes are common and bigger animals that could attack my dogs are common. And I mean, I have had to risk my own safety in order to help them, which obviously isn't as noble as your daily fun for your future, but to me it still means a lot.
Oh yeah, no, I would definitely take those risks too, especially if it comes to like friends or family. So I agree with you, TJ.
Yeah, I love the different approaches you all took to this question. Definitely insightful and also comedic in some ways. But to move on to the next question, what do you think are the risks of using the internet on a daily basis, DJ?
Definitely, you've always heard of the blue light or whatever it is that is damaging to your eyes. I mean, why do you think I wear glasses? Probably because I watched so much TV as a kid. But, you've always got the situation of people trying to figure out who you are, where you live, which of course is kind of low. I feel like the whole blue light issue is definitely a more prominent risk that you face every day, just being on any kind of screen, not just the internet.
Totally agree. Julyanna?
Something that at least I've personally dealt with and like I've seen from those around me is that the risk of using social media constantly is that experience that we get from these apps, it kind of gives us like these false expectations, and then we are constantly finding ourselves comparing to everyone that we see on social media, which kind of just displays like a false portrait of like what our life should be. So I think from that use of social media is we risk our mental health in that aspect, because we kind of just start degrading ourselves in a sense.
I totally agree. Using the internet does have high risks of damaging your mental health, and it can take a huge toll on some people. And Raquel?
Okay, so I think that one risk is getting too lost into other people's worlds and, finding yourself too absorbed into people's snippets of their best parts of their lives. And I think that's where comparison and like insecurity will sometimes come from. Or we also risk putting too much out there. So really, that line between being too transparent or not. And this is kind of difficult because obviously you want to relate and connect with other people, but you also don't want to risk your safety or the other backlash you could get from others as well. So it's kind of like a hit or miss about the information you put on the internet or who you're communicating with.
All extremely useful and insightful information that, yes, our viewers should definitely take note of. The internet is not this perfect place. But to move on to the next question, what are the risks of not taking risks? First up is Raquel.
Well, I think you risk the best outcome because, especially when you're taking calculated risks, you're most likely going to get something good out of it unless you're not really thinking about it. So, for example, if you're thinking about making a change, I think the biggest risk that you can take in not taking that is not seeing the change you were thinking of. And I think a mindset has a lot to do with that. And it will definitely help with the outcome of taking risks. And you can also face not taking those when you don't take a risk, if that makes sense.
Totally makes sense. I understand completely what you were trying to say. And now DJ.
Again, I looked at this from a different point of view with the same kind of thought process ever since my fourth grade teacher asked me, what would you wish for in a genie? And I said, I would wish for more genies since I can't ask for more wishes. So I still went with that same kind of smart aleck thought process here. And I thought, well, every single step you take has the risk of you tripping and falling. So if you don't take any risks, you didn't take any risks at all, you wouldn't do anything, because everything has a negative consequence. Everything has a positive consequence. And it's just, sometimes you just have to take that leap and understand the positives far outweigh the negatives here.
And Julyanna.
The risk of not taking risks is sort of that if you don't take these risks that, sort of come to mind, I think you're just always going to be left wondering like, hey, what would have happened if I would have done this or if I would have done that? So I think you probably would be doing so much better, probably have opened so many opportunities and accomplishments if you do take those steps forward.
Thank you guys for your answers to all of the questions. Very insightful and very helpful. Hopefully our listeners got a few pointers and tips out of that. Now I'm going to give you guys examples of some people who took risks. I will be sharing 2 stories, and the first story follows this. On June 18th, 1971, the founder and current CEO of FedEx, Frederick W. Smith, founded the company Federal Express, which is FedEx, with his $4 million inheritance and raised an additional $91 million in venture capital such that it could potentially deliver packages overnight to anywhere in the world. This is something that at the time had never been done. Unfortunately, 3 years after the company began, because of the rapidly rising fuel costs, FedEx was on the verge of bankruptcy, losing over $1 million a month, with no one willing to give them any additional loans, nor any investors interested in contributing. Smith reached a point when the company's account had only $5,000 and he couldn't afford to refuel the planes that delivered FedEx's shipments. Smith made a final pitch to General Dynamics for more funding, but was refused, leaving FedEx more or less dead on the ground when they would not be able to fuel their planes the following Monday. Still, Smith refused to surrender. He took the last $5,000 and flew to Las Vegas, placed the company's remaining money on blackjack bets over the weekend, and won an additional $27,000 by Monday. It wasn't a huge windfall, but the total $32,000 was enough to refuel the planes and keep the business running for a few more days. After a few days, Smith successfully managed to raise $11 million to keep the company afloat, and by 1976, FedEx made its first profit of $3.6 million. If he had given up and didn't take the risk of gambling, there wouldn't be a FedEx now. Now, group, I want to hear your thoughts, examples of something similar, if you have one, or whatever comes to mind when you hear the story that I just told now. First up is Julyanna.
I just think that this shows the relation of the question we discussed earlier, that there's risk of not taking risks, because even though, yeah, you could say that he lost a lot of money and that he would have been completely bankrupt and all, but I think that because I also imagine, obviously, that he knew what he was doing and was conscious with his actions and decisions, making that he said to himself, I'm going to do whatever it takes, and he made those risks, which, as we see, just leads to great successful outcomes.
I think this is a good example of, it comes to show that not everything in life is really easy, and just because it's hard at first doesn't mean nothing good is going to come out of it, or that you're not going to see a positive change in the end, because obviously he became super successful in the end, even if he had to risk a lot of his own stuff. And so it shows a really good risk, even though at first it seemed bad.
So I'd like to start off by saying I do not endorse gambling, because unlike other risks, it is completely up to luck. Unless you're playing blackjack and counting cards, that's not a risk at all, because you're cheating. But I'd like to say this is an incredible story. I mean, as you were reading it, I thought it was going to be a failure story. Although mentally I know FedEx is still a prominent company. I don't know what I was thinking. But obviously, this is kind of one of those things where you do have to take risks. Risks are a necessary part of life in order to advance in your own life. Of course, gambling isn't the best option, but he did get lucky, and I do have to commend him for that. Although I wouldn't sit there and say, hey, by the way, your main source of income is probably going to be very good for gambling. I don't believe that at all. He did get lucky, and it did pay off for him.
Thank you, group, for that insight. And now we will be moving on to our second story that did not have such as wonderful of an ending. Before I started at my current company, I was involved in another business venture that was completely different and failed miserably. I was the managing partner in a gourmet, build-your-own gingerbread house company. We sold gingerbread house kits in kiosks and malls. There were many problems we encountered, but mostly, we failed to understand the market. Whether it's computers or video games or all the other distractions, children just don't do as many arts and crafts projects with their parents anymore. We spent over $250,000 on the idea, and it failed. It was awful. So, thoughts on this story?
Obviously, we know that the outcomes of this event wasn't the greatest, but I just like to view it as not so much of like what was lost, but at the end of the day, that how big of a risk they took, and that they probably did have some success, but I think that's just the lesson that we learned with risk taking, that we can't really define what are going to be our outcomes. And it's just something through that process that we have to learn on ourselves and just make use of it in our personal life. Like, hey, how do I evaluate my risk better for the future?
I think this is a good life lesson because it shows, sometimes things don't go as planned, and that can be applied everywhere, not just in business. It shows kind of like the truth of things, because oftentimes we see so much success, and then when we hit failure ourselves, it sucks because it seems like everyone else is super successful, but then on the other hand, we don't see all of this as well. So it's a really good kind of like spread of information to kind of show everyone that we all start somewhere, and at one point in our lives, we are going to fail, and that's okay.
I definitely agree with Raquel, but I did want to say neither of these are responsible risks. They're business ventures, and business ventures are almost always incredibly high risk, but also incredibly high reward. And as I said earlier, in my opinion, responsible risk taking is when you're willing to deal with the negative. And honestly, losing that much money, 250,000, that's a big loss. And I don't think personally I would be willing to deal with that. Somebody who's more rich, like Jeff Bezos, that's like chump change for them. So of course, for them, this is a responsible risk, because 250,000 to open up an entirely new business, not that much of a risk. But for us who don't have 250K lying around, it's a big issue. For our target audience, who probably isn't ridiculous billionaires, this isn't going to be a responsible risk, but it does show that sometimes you do have to take those risks, and whether it fails or whether it succeeds, you just don't know.
I just wanted to comment on what you were saying, because I think that's so true, and we kind of didn't really talk about that, where it is easier for people who are more outgoing and have that drive, and also of course the funding, the money, and the resources or supplies to make risks, and they're more likely to take them, versus maybe people who don't have as much money or those resources to take those risks. So I think factors like that definitely play into what the outcomes of risks turn out to be.
Once again, wonderful insight from the group. Thank you all so much for participating, and that is going to conclude today's episode. Please stay tuned for our next upcoming episode later this week, and check the description for our socials and our website. Thank you all so much for joining.